Zoom. So first, since we have so many folks here, I wanted to share the Gordon School is a racially diverse nursery through 8th grade coeducational independent school here in East Providence, Rhode Island. Child by child, the Gordon School community cultivates successful students by inspiring joyful learning, encouraging intellectual leadership, fostering an empathetic spirit, and stimulating a drive for positive societal impact. And so really just restating what our mission statement is, to share with all of you, this is really what these conversations are absolutely rooted in. So good morning, everybody, again, and thank you for joining us. It's been a historic and exciting week here on campus, as well as in the wider United States. We've witnessed democracy in action and also our justice system working as the way it should. This conversation is one in a string of conversations focused on our community here at Gordon and our connections to the greater society as a whole. Today's conversation will focus on leadership and the justice system, where we are in history today, and what biases are at play in this system and within our society. So our guests will dive into the criminal justice reform, bias as I shared, and what we can all do next. So today we have two very exciting guests. We have the Honorable John James McConnell Jr., Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court of Rhode Island, who is also the parent of 3 alums, John, Maggie, and Catherine. Jack was nominated to the federal bench in 2011 by President Obama. He sits here in Rhode Island and handles a caseload of civil and criminal matters. Prior to taking the bench, Jack was a trial attorney for 25 years, representing people who were injured by asbestos exposure, states that sued the tobacco industry, and children injured by lead poisoning. So we're really excited and privileged to have Jack here with us, and so thank you. Our second guest needs a small introduction, I think, since we do have some folks that are not currently here with us on campus. And so our second guest is our head of school, Dr. Noni Thomas López. She's been here with us at Gordon since July of 2018. And directly before joining Gordon School, Dr. Thomas López worked for 20 years, or her career, she worked for 20 years as a teacher and administrator in independent schools in New York City. And immediately prior to joining us here in Rhode Island, she was the assistant head of school for teaching and learning at the Ethical Cultural Fieldstone School, where she was responsible for overseeing curriculum, instruction, faculty development, and a strategic academic initiative from pre-K to 8th grade. Noni has brought Gordon School into the national spotlight, and we're honored and privileged to have her leading our community. And so this morning, we were all lucky to have Noni and Jack in conversation on this critical topic that is that is absolutely intertwined in our curriculum. So first, we're going to hear from both Jack and Noni a little bit on leadership in the justice system in America, how they came into their careers, and what inspires their work for 2021. So how this will work, we'll hear from both of them independently, and then Noni is going to dive right in and ask Jack some questions, and then there will absolutely be an opportunity for all of us to ask questions at the end. And if something comes to mind, please pop it into the chat and we'll weave it into the conversation. So without further ado, here is Chief Judge Jack McConnell.
Thanks a lot, Claire. It seems rather odd to be introduced like that amongst my Gordon family and friends. Let me just start by acknowledging how important and how much Gordon is part of who we are as a family and who I am as a person. We started there in the 1990s with Catherine. We had heard about this Gordon School across the river, sent our daughter to the then summer art camp, and then just found this amazing community in that summer program and knew we wanted to send our kids there. We lasted at Gordon 20 plus straight years with our youngest son, John. We've seen a lot at Gordon, and Gordon's seen a lot of us over those 20 some odd years. Our son graduating in 2011, 10 years ago. Let me also say that it's great to be on this with so many of the folks that were around then, because the thing I think I'm the most proud of out of Gordon is that back in the 90s, it took on a very, at times, taboo subject, but a most important one back then, and that was issues of racial justice. And I look at Sarah and Linda and Lynn Bowman and others that started bringing that to the forefront of Gordon's mission and the hard work they did. And it is just beyond a delight to see Claire mentioned it again in the mission. It was Ralph Wales' leadership from inside, and now to see Noni continue it, I can't tell you how pleased that makes me. So I've been a judge for 10 years. As Claire said, I was nominated by President Obama. I had a little bit of a rough nomination process that I don't want to go into. It lasted about 2 years, believe it or not. We talk about the divisiveness in Washington now. It was equally as tough and divided back in the early 2010s. And then last year I became chief judge of the District of Rhode Island. There are 96 districts throughout the country. Rhode Island is a single district. It's not a great feat that I became chief. I only got there because of my age. It rotates by statute. So every 7 years, the next most senior judge becomes the chief, whether you're good, bad, or indifferent. So I became chief about a year ago, which is for those thinking about elevating into higher or executive positions. It's not really smart to start out being in charge during a pandemic. It's kind of actually mind-blowing. Talk about feeling like you're standing in front of a fire hydrant with water just shooting at you. And that's what happened in March when we got first wind of this pandemic, and all of a sudden had to think about the principles of justice and how do we continue the principles and the values of the justice system and continue it during a pandemic. I closed the courthouse March 12th. We have not actually opened the building since. We closed it on a Friday, and on Monday, we were back up and running at 100% operations, but just remotely. We've conducted justice, whether it's civil law, civil disputes, or whether it's criminal justice remotely, and we've done it incredibly effectively and efficiently. And that's one of the things that kind of leads me into what I want to say about leadership. The most important thing for us was identifying what I refer to in the courthouse as our North Star. And to me, that's the number one priority and goal of good leaders, is seeing, identifying and following your North Star. And you had to do that really quickly in this pandemic because you had two North Stars, you had two values that you had to worry about. One was, how do you operate the justice system? We can't just let the justice system fall apart because of the pandemic, on the one hand. On the other hand, you don't realize how many human beings are involved in the criminal justice system from a physical sense. And you had to keep them safe, as well as contribute to the community safety. So keeping our people safe, whether it be defendants in a criminal setting that come before us, or attorneys, or staff members, or U.S. Marshals, or probation officers, keeping them safe was our North Star through this pandemic. And we quickly figured out how to use technology to keep up with the values. And if people are interested, we can talk about that during question and answer. But leadership to me is all about identifying that North Star and following it. I believe in the model of leadership called servant leaders, that in fact, we lead through service. That's my philosophy in being chief. That's how I try and lead the court. In normal non-pandemic times, our North Star is doing efficient and effective justice, and ensuring that we always remember that we're public servants, and that servant part of it requires us to continually ensure that we're serving our various constituencies. There have been many stars this week. One of the most, I think, who is one of my new heroes is Amanda Gorman, the poet laureate, who wrote a poem. And let me just end with leadership because it kind of fits into this North Star concept. She said that there's always light if we were brave enough to see it, and if we're brave enough to be it. And I think leaders are those that are brave enough to see the light, know where it says, and follow it, and and go from there. So that's my little introduction. We can talk more specific about criminal justice and civil rights and riots and pandemics and 4 years and everything else when we get into some more substance in a conversation with Noni.
Great, and now Noni, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Sure, Jack, thank you. And I hate following you and talking about leadership, but I'll give it a try. The topic of leadership and justice in America are closely tied for me. People who have heard my story of how I came to Gordon know that I started my teaching career in independent school, and it was because I at one time thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but when the time came to really make that decision my senior year of college, I realized the passion wasn't there for 3 more years of law school, LSATs, all of that stuff. But throughout my life, the law had been a fascination for me. My family, my father is Black, my mother's Puerto Rican. We grew up understanding, hearing about the civil rights movement, the people who worked in that movement, fight for racial justice. I grew up in the South, so I was witness to a lot of injustice in my young age, and always saw the court system as a way, and perhaps naively as a child, but you think about Thurgood Marshall and you think about some of the incredible ways that the Supreme Court decisions have transformed life in a positive way in America. And I always saw the law as a vehicle for justice. And learned later about the biases and whatnot that can infect that system, and I'm grateful for those who are out there like Jack, disinfecting our system. So I have a great respect for the law and what the rule of law can do in this particular country. But my career led me in a different path to education, and unexpectedly so. But I went back to the school that I graduated from, which is a predominantly white independent school in North Carolina, and remembered my experience, which in many ways was positive, but in many ways was really hard. As the only Black female in my class, seeing things in the school, speaking out about them, but sometimes feeling not heard. And sometimes wondering about my place, sometimes not so much from a race perspective, but from a class perspective. And those inequities pushed me to think about leadership almost immediately. As soon as I got my first assistant teaching job in 5th grade, I was also interested in leadership, because I was interested in being around the table where decision-making was happening. And I wanted to be a part of that, a conversation. Much later in life, when I was taking kind of a leadership personality or whatever assessment, the particular assessment, I can't remember what it was, but there were 2 things that bubbled up to the top in terms of describing who I am as a leader. One of them was relationships, and the other was power. The second one was power. And that was really embarrassing to see. And I didn't understand what it meant, because it didn't kind of align with how I thought about myself as a leader, which is very much aligned with what Jack is talking about, servant leadership, that I'm here to lead and serve others and serve causes that are important to me. But what I found talking to the person who did the assessment was that the things that are happening in the world and the things that I'm interested in addressing, I see that leadership is the way to make a difference. That the power that we're talking about in some ways is social power. And how does a leader bring people together to think about their own mission, their own purpose, an organization's mission and purpose, and create positive change? And so that made me feel better about having power at the top of my leadership profile. But I think it is accurate. And it's why I'm in schools, and it's why I'm at Gordon in particular, because it's hard, I think, for a leader who grounds themselves in purpose to be at an institution that doesn't align with that purpose. And you can be in schools sometimes, particularly independent schools, where there's some things happening that you're working to change, but they're very difficult to shift. And that is good work, that's sacred work. And I'm just thankful I don't have to do that kind of work at Gordon School. Don't get me wrong, there's work for us to do, and there will always be work for our school to do. But in terms of its mission and purpose, and Jack referred to the work that happened way before, I got to Gordon. And I knew about that work, Jack, down in New York City in the 90s that Gordon was doing. And to be here now leading this school is something akin to a dream come true. But that alignment of mission, purpose, stewardship, which is important to me in leadership, that's my North Star, to use Jack's words, and to create spaces where other folks can find their purpose, and in some ways pay that forward as leaders as well. I just think good leaders are creating other good leaders. And that's the work that I do leading a school, because these are our leaders of tomorrow.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm with you. I wanted to be at Gordon long before I came here too. So reputation, precedes our wonderful institution. So now I'm going to hand it over to Noni to ask some questions and be in conversation. And remember, if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to pop them in the chat, or you can wait and you can ask them verbally.
Great, thank you, Claire. All right, Jack, let's jump in. Just for our audience, a quick primer on federal courts. Why should we care about federal courts? We know that there's certain groups that really care about federal courts and appointing judges, but what's important for us to know about the federal justice system?
So there's a number of ways to answer that. There's federal versus state, and I'll leave that alone. We can talk when we're with a bunch of lawyers about that. So let me actually more talk about the courts in particular, but the federal courts have kind of been a shining example of this. So what's happened over the last 4 years or so, and at other times in our country's history, going back to the Civil War and Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws, the civil rights, and during the last 4 years, is that the values that we live by, the constitutional values that form the basis of our country, have been tested, and our institutions have been tested in ways that I don't think a lot of folks thought would survive. It got tested in the 1800s by a war, and we survived the war. Sometimes well and sometimes not so well, but that's for another story. So what we saw the last 4 years in my mind was a new testing of it, and how I think about it is it's like a balloon, and you're blowing up a balloon, and you keep pushing that air in. Well, at some point the balloon's going to pop, right? And it feels like over the last 4 years, with the challenges that have occurred to the rule of law in this country, that we came very close to that balloon popping, but it didn't. The system worked, and the system sustained itself, and the institutions that we cherish, and I'm here to talk about one of those being the courts, kept that balloon from popping, even as large as it got blown up. And the courts were one way of doing that. The courts are what kind of stand between arbitrary actions by our government and the people. And that's where the courts sit in this unique position. If you think about it, we popularly elect Congress, right? It's the most, except for the Senate, but the House particularly is popularly elected representative of the people directly. We directly elect those people, and they operate on a majority rule basis, right? So 50 plus one wins the day in how we pass laws. And that's how that part of government works. And then the executive, who we again sort of popularly elect, I won't get into the electoral college, but with a couple of steps we popularly elect, and they have to implement the laws, and they have to do it consistent with the rule of law. And where the courts sit is the courts sit not as a representative of the majority. In fact, we sit as a representative of the minority, and I mean minority in the largest sense of the word, whether it's minority of opinion or whether it's a minority of race or minority of gender or person or idea. Courts stand are part of this democratic republic that we have that ensures that democracy, right, which is the part where we actually all have a vote, and a republic, which is the representatives that represent us, stay true to the values, to the North Star of the Constitution and the rule of law. And so why should you care? You should care because we're the only things that stand in between an oppressive, arbitrary government and actions by individuals or by the majority. Oftentimes, I mean, when we saw, the Jim Crow laws and whatnot, where courts stand and enforce the rule of law that is against arbitrary and capricious actions by what could be a tyrant or could be whatnot. We saw plenty of examples of that recently, and it enforces our values. Our values, in a legal sense, are the Constitution, and it's that reason that, and we saw, and there are plenty of examples over history, and there's plenty of examples over the last 4 years where it's the courts that kept that balloon from bursting when it was challenged. So that's why you should care about the courts, and because it affects so many aspects of people's lives that they don't even know about it, and it affects society in such a big way. I mean, when we talk about criminal justice, we'll talk about what effect it has on people of color and races and communities and whatnot. But to me, that's why the courts stand so important. They are a very different, equal branch of government that protects the values of this country against arbitrary majority rules, to protect those values for everybody.
Absolutely.
And we do a lot of mundane, stupid, regular stuff too, besides those lofty goals of maintaining values. I can tell you some fun ones about that sometime.
Like all of us, it's not always the high flying values and ideals in our work.
No, let me tell you real quick. One of the first cases
ahead.
I had, and only because it relates to Gordon School, is Bob Fine, who is he actually went to Gordon many years ago, a great lawyer in Providence. He was one of the first lawyers to appear before me, and he came in and he represented a toy company, and the toy company had bought defective bubble stuff. So the toy made this lawnmower machine, and you put bubbles in it. I call it bubble stuff. You put bubble stuff in it, and it would blow out bubbles. Well, the bubbles didn't work, so that it was defective. So he sued the bubble manufacturer. I hear Bob is with us today, so I should let him tell the story. But I tell you, and I came in and I said, "Well, how long is this trial going to take?" And Bob said, "Oh, there he is. Hey, Bob." Bob said to me, "It'll take 2 seconds, Your Honor. I'm going to get before the jury and go, see, it doesn't work." And ever since then, I was grounded on the fact that sticking up for racial justice and liberties in the Constitution were going to be important work to do, but making sure that companies got proper bubble stuff was also going to be part of my job.
Bubbles have been a big hit during outdoor education here at Gordon, so it's an important, and you're doing good work, Judge.
Well, you've got a lawyer here that can represent you if you get the bad stuff, and that would be Bob Fine.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. There was a Gordon School family that was involved in the case on the winning side.
You have to love Rhode Island.
Thanks.
We digress. Sorry, Noni.
No, it's not a problem at all. I'll bring us back to talking about you talked about courts protecting minorities in the larger sense. And a lot of times we think about judge or justice, we have this vision of kind of impartiality. And you kind of stand back without any opinions, thoughts, and you kind of make a decision on, facts of the case. But you've talked about the important role of courts in criminal justice reform and the appropriate role of courts in criminal justice reform. Can you talk about that work and why you feel it's an important and appropriate role for those within the court system, like judges?
Sure. Yeah, so too often to really understand this, we fall back on kind of a stereotypical comment that judges should have no opinions and whatnot, and that's just not true. If that were the case, we would have computers run our justice system, and we would input this, and we'd input that, and we'd input this, and we'd spin the wheel, and out would come the proper decision. But that's not how justice works, nor should it work like that. I particularly those people that know me know I have opinions. I have opinions about a lot of things. Some are relevant, some aren't relevant. But what makes the system work is this fidelity to the rule of law. And it sounds like a cliche, but it's so important. And that is that you respect the fact that laws are passed according to the democratic system. You respect the fact that the Constitution contains values and protects our freedoms and protects the minority against the will of the oppression of the majority, and you enforce that. And what it takes is not having an opinion. I have very strong opinions about the rule of law. I think the rule of law should be enforced. I have very strong opinions about the Constitution and how it should play out. The key to me is that you bring empathy to whatever you do as a judge, and that's not sympathy, but it's empathy. And I'll define that. That means that you can stand in someone else's shoes. That's how I use the term. That you can walk in someone else's shoes, so that when you're deciding on how a statute should be interpreted for a particular person, when you should decide on someone's freedoms and whether they're being violated through government actions, when you're sentencing someone, when we talk about sentencing, that you have to take a moment and realize that this, middle-class white male privileged person needs to understand the human being that comes before us, that may be a woman, and may be Black, may be transgender, may be poor, may be rich, may be whatever, may have experiences that aren't yours, and you have to walk in their shoes and understand that the law applies to them where they are, and then you have to apply the law accordingly. So the goal, where we lose our ways, is when we lose that rule of law. Yeah. And when you realize that those values that are in the Constitution and the statutes that we pass through the democratic process, if you keep those front and center, and that's your opinion, then the court system's going to work. But we say everyone walks into the courtroom equal, right? And technically that's the case, but sadly it's not. And that's what gets into, I'm both a judge and an administrator now that I'm chief. That's what gets into the part about how do you administer the justice system in a just way. And that's where the two parallel tracks take place.
What are some of the things that you've been working on to ensure that it's administered, justice is, the law is administered in a just way?
So one of the, we haven't publicly announced this yet, we only have internally, but we have put together a diversity and inclusion and racial justice committee that has 3 goals. One is to look internally. I don't think we can solve this problem until we look at ourselves. But the committee has stated its mission in understanding that in many ways racism is a white people's problem, and white people need to figure out how to solve it and need to do the hard work to fixing it. So we have formed a committee to look at race in our courts. Have we given disparate sentences between black and whites? What are our hiring practices like? What's the treatment process, right? Have we been a welcoming, inclusive community? The second is to look internally, actually, on that issue, which is what we are like as an employer. We're an employer that provides a workplace, and we want to be a just and inclusive place. And then the second is engagement. Third is the engagement in community. We're starting to figure out how we can go out into the community and engage more with the message of the rule of law and justice, particularly in underserved communities. And some not so much. In prior days, Gordon School used to come in, and we'd welcome them every year and welcome them along the way. So that's what we've done initially. We've also become transparent. You know, this Zoom thing, people say, oh, how hard it must be. It is hard to administer during Zoom world, but the benefit, and I'm kind of a Pollyanna. I like to look at the glasses completely full, even though there's only a few drops in it. Yeah, Sarah's shaking her head. She knows that it's kind of a curse that I see it that way. But one of the benefits of this pandemic is how transparent the courts have become. So every day, you now can sit in your home or in your office. I see Crystal's here sitting maybe at home or in her office. Other lawyers are on the Zoom call, and you can watch what goes on in court. We post it on our website. Family members, particularly, it's been great during sentencing, can now come without the need. We've had people from all over the world watch our proceedings. So the transparency has helped. So that's another goal that I've tried to impose in the last year. And then the last one is to change our focus from one of being served to one of service. So we have spotlighted customer service as our number one goal. We will not pass a rule or adopt regulation internally unless we figure out how is it going to affect the lawyers that practice there, how is it going to affect the litigants, as opposed to how we serve ourselves, and realize that we have other constituencies. So those have been the three big things that, and then you throw the pandemic in, and
it's a lot. It's a lot,
yeah.
But that's incredible work that you're engaging in that committee. Connected to that, and thinking about just representation, and we had a really historic week with the swearing in of Kamala Harris, and so many of us, see ourselves in her. And I wonder if you could talk about the diversity or not of the federal bench, and what that means to not have a diverse bench, or what the positives are of having a diverse bench. Certainly diversity of opinion, as you say, but does it mean something to have visible diversity in the bench?
Yeah, so Sarah and Lynn and Linda and others involved in the work really drilled into me that it really is important that we talk about racial diversity. That while diversity in many different ways are important, but if we don't focus on racial diversity, then we're missing the world. So let me talk about racial diversity. The federal court in Rhode Island is a sad example of a lack of racial diversity. We have 5 judicial officers, 3 judges, 2 magistrate judges. We're all white. We have 2 women. We didn't have that for the longest time, judges, 1 judge and 1 magistrate judge. The majority of our court staff is white. It's a great place to work, so people don't leave. So that's been very hard to impact. We've not had a new hire, I think, in many years there, because people stick around. And so we're a sad example of it, which is why we need to put in place. On the other hand, our probation department, which works directly with people once they get out of the criminal justice system, when I got there, was all white. And when we hired a new probation officer, we said, this can't be. This just cannot be any longer. And we immediately got 4 openings, just happen to be, and we filled them with people of color, and we've now changed probation department. Just think about it for a second in that empathetic sort of way. You're an African-American young man who is predominantly criminal defendants, and you get walked into a court, and our court is majestic. I mean, it is, here, I'll show you. It is stunningly, beautifully majestic. It brings out all of the you can see how we hold court. This is the background, and you get brought into this gigantic, beautiful, majestic courtroom, and you're in shackles. You know, you're in chains, and you're being led along by a white U.S. Marshal, and everyone that you pass in the corridor is white. And you walk in, and you know, it's likely that most of the lawyers are white, and in you walk in, and out comes this guy in a robe, another white person, and you got to believe that you're asking yourself, do they understand who I am? Do they know who I am? Is there any sympathy? Is there any relationship to me? You've got my life in your hands. And so it's not, so a lot of it is optics, right? A lot of it is it, but a lot of it's reality, right? But a lot of it is reality. Diversity isn't just optics. Diversity is actually substance, right? So, yeah. So the fact that you know, I've never been subjected to I've never been personally subjected to racism, and racism plays such a huge role in the criminal justice system, from who gets stopped to who gets arrested to who gets prosecuted, and how they get prosecuted, and how they spend time in jail, and everything along that horrible road. I've never experienced that. And that makes it hard, or it makes it easy to ignore that, right? Right. But it makes it hard not to when there's no diversity, when you don't have colleagues that you can speak to, or when you're not diverse yourself. And make no mistake about it, race is present every single day in the courtroom, predominantly in criminal cases, but it's present in a goodly number of the civil cases that we do as well. So. You know, diversity is important everywhere. It is vitally important in the judiciary. You know, it's not shocking that President Obama had a great track record of ensuring diversity, racial diversity amongst the bench. President Trump, not so much. I don't think he pointed a single person of color to the Court of Appeals, right, and very few people to the district court. So I'm hoping that President Biden will prioritize racial diversity on the bench as well, because if you don't have diversity of thought, then the courts aren't going to work right? Because if we're there to protect the minority while upholding the values of the Constitution, then it's going to be, you know, middle class white male rule continues.
The two things came to mind as you're talking. One is what Brian Stevenson talks about in terms of, you know, healing our country from if it's racialized history, is proximity, living next to, understanding the experience of those who are suffering in our society, and how often are we placed in those, you know, positions, particularly white folks, to be in proximity with those who are suffering. As a judge, that suffering walks into your courtroom, you know, I'm sure every day. So it speaks, I think, particularly to the importance of empathy. There's some folks who are asking, my second thing that came to mind, there are folks who are asking about, you know, what if a judge doesn't have that empathetic, you know, bent? What's the recourse when judges are using either, you know, structurally, you know, racist perspectives or their own experience that it has to influence, and we know that it does. It seems to speak to the importance of what we talked about earlier. Why should we care about, you know, the federal courts? Is that our role in that as citizens is who we elect to appoint those judges. Is that correct?
Sure. So federal judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. In reality, at my level, the district court level, It's your United States senators that nominate you, and at the district court level, the White House, whoever the president is, generally just sends the nomination along. So who your senators are is vital in terms of what the judiciary is going to look like, because they're going to make those initial representations. And so when you want to have an impact on the federal judiciary, you know, it's your senators and it's who's the president that kind of matters the most. You know, we're in Rhode Island, it's kind of the same way, but it's the governor and the Senate for the state courts.
Great. So I think sometimes that's lost on folks, kind of their role in the shape of the judiciary is through their exercising their rights to vote.
The right to vote, yeah, and the right to make use of the judiciary to right wrongs. You know, I say that all the time. I've got the greatest job in the world. I get up every day and I get to go to work and right wrongs. It's kind of a cool thing to do.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna
and make sure that bubble stuff is up to snuff.
That's crucial.
It was for that manufacturer.
Claire, we're at 9:30. Did you want to open it up for questions?
Of course. And as someone who's dealt with like some not so great bubbles and a 3-year-old throwing a tantrum, it's critical, really critical. Why don't they work? I don't know. Thank you for that. We've had a couple questions, and I think one, to distill it, Alex asked a great one of, you know, we all know that President Trump appointed more federal judges than I think any of his predecessors. And so how scared and nervous should our populations be? Let it be on racial issues, let it be on sexual identification issues. And so what is the kind of the role down the hill going to be from that?
Sure. So just to put a distinction on it, President Trump appointed more people in his first term than any other president did during their first term. So President Obama actually appointed more judges, but he had 2 terms, and the same with Bill Clinton and others. But during his first term, he clearly focused on it. And there's no doubt that the Republican Party focuses much more strongly on the issue of the appointment of judges than the Democratic Party, and I won't get into why or whatever. It's just a reality, and so that's been the case. And maybe I'll say something that people won't believe or understand, but at the district court level, where we deal with where the rubber hits the road on the law, right? The judges that get appointed are not overly ideological, and the vast majority of stuff we do is individual justice in individual cases and individual senses. And I find that regardless of which party appoints district judges, that the vast majority of them are decent, admirable people committed to the rule of law and following and doing justice. I don't think we have a district court bench filled with racists. I mean, we all have racism, obviously, but not the overt kind. So I think where he's had the biggest influence is the largest number is district court judges. I tend to think that they do their jobs and they do it pretty well, and they follow the rule of law. They're ones that are, you know, tilt more conservative and some tilt more liberal, but that all comes out in the wash. Where the problem really is, and where the ideology comes in, is how political the Supreme Court has gotten, and now, sadly, the courts of appeals, and that's where the greatest influence of politicizing the judiciary has come in, so that you often now see rulings that are really not rule of law rulings out of the Supreme Court. They're really political rulings, and they're really, and that's the most disheartening to me to see. Where you see the rule of law no longer followed, but rather a political ideology, or God forbid, you know, an allegiance to a leader or to an individual takes place. So long way of saying, I'm not really. I think that the districts are going to continue to do district courts are going to continue to do justice as long as people continue to bring their disputes to us. I'd be really concerned about the Supreme Court and more the courts of appeals.
We do have a Supreme Court question. Care to share your thoughts on expanding the Supreme Court?
No, I do not care to.
You want to guess who put you on the spot for that question? You want to guess who put you on the spot for that question?
It's either my wife or Bob Fine. I'm not sure which. So
your wife.
My wife, yeah. Actually, no, it's a different Sarah. She's saying.
Oh, sorry.
Anyway, no, I really don't want to, because that's a political decision that the political branches will decide, and they should decide that. So yeah, no, I try to stay out of. I want to stay in my lane.
Sounds good.
And besides that, I probably don't have an opinion one way or the other. But
folks are asking, do you see a path for depoliticizing the courts? Are we on a is it just waiting till these folks pass on, or is there a way to get us back to a better place in the upper courts?
So, again, it's Pollyanna in me that's coming out again. I'm sorry, but I do believe that if we continue to talk about the rule of law and the importance of the rule of law being our North Star, and if we continue to, I'm on many committees within the court system, and we're constantly talking about how do we educate the public and internally about the independence of the judiciary and the non-politicization of the judiciary. I think if we keep that up, and I think on some level we have a Chief Justice Roberts, right, who understands that the institution is veering too political and should be less so. He's clearly of a conservative mindset, but I do believe that he does think that the politicization, and I think maybe he will continue to try. Now, that doesn't speak to whether rights are going to be upheld or whatnot, but I do think in terms of the lack of politicalization, he at least is going to try and keep us within our lanes.
Great. Thank you. So we have a case law question, if you're up for it. This is from Bill Bowden, who's a longtime Gordon faculty member. Bill, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question yourself.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, how are you?
Great, how are you?
Good. As some people in this community know, I have a child with a disability. So I'm interested in disability issues. And I know one of the issues is the consent decree that was brought about by events at the Birch School. And I was wondering if you could speak broadly about the implications of that case on people who have disabilities in Rhode Island.
Sure. So I can only talk broadly about it because the case is before me. And just to give you a quick background, a number of years ago, the United States government sued the state. Actually, they threatened to sue them, and then they negotiated a settlement, and then they filed suit to effectuate the settlement because large numbers of our folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities were being treated unconstitutionally. They were basically providing slave labor. So they were in the workforce and they were getting paid sub-minimum wage, $1 an hour or here or there to be in sheltered workshops. They were congregated in large numbers in centers and facilities. And there's a famous Supreme Court case called Olmstead, Olmstead. And Olmstead came forward and basically rewrote what the Constitution requires for how states treat people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So the state agreed that by 2024, that every person with, if I can just say IDD, intellectual and developmental disabilities, everyone with IDD that wanted to work would have work, that they'd have the job coaches and the support that they needed for it, and that those that weren't able to work had independent living situations that recognized individual choice and individuality as opposed to congregate settings. The state agreed to that, and now it's my job to monitor it. I recently issued an order that was a little bit more involved in state government than most courts like to be, but you get to the point sometimes where you have to be. One of the big problems in the IDD world is the ability for support systems, for people to keep support systems, and the pay was slightly above minimum wage, so they weren't able to find people to work job support systems and whatnot. So I just issued an order telling the state that they had to increase the wages of support systems up to $20 by fiscal year 2024, and do certain other measures that would guarantee that the consent decree was followed, and then negotiating how that will be implicated now. So it's a great example of the Constitution, which protects folks' individual rights with developmental disabilities, and government, right, and how it's treated, and the consent decree says that our state had been treating people with developmental disabilities unconstitutionally, and it's the court's job to enforce that for a minority, right, there. So that's where we are with that case, and it will go on for another 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
Not unlike cases that desegregated schools, consent decrees that desegregated school systems, or ensured, gender equality in certain workplaces, and various other issues that the consent decrees have worked.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for your question, Bill. It's good to
Yeah.
see you. One last question from parent Pam Hitchman. How can the courts play a greater role in reducing the school to prison pipeline?
Wow. It's funny because I thought that's what we were going to talk about the whole time. So Pam, thank you for asking that. One of the greatest scourges on society, but also the entire justice system, is the racial injustice in mass incarceration. And thank God lately we've at least begun to talk about it, because I don't think most people realize that we're living in a 16th, 17th, 18th century system in our prison system. The United States has 5% of the world's population, 5% of the world's population, but we imprison 25% of the world's incarcerated people. We incarcerate more people than any other country in the world by far, 5 times more than we do. And needless to say, disproportionately, those are people of color. The statistics will blow your mind. If we continue on in the system that we have right now, 1 in 3 African-American males born today, 1 in 3 will end up incarcerated. 1 in 6 Hispanics will be. Those numbers should shock everyone. They should, I mean, the world should stop, right? And we should say the entire world should work on racial justice in our prison system, because I think when history is told, we're going to equate what's going on in the criminal justice system to what was going on during Civil War, in slavery days, and what was going on during Jim Crow laws. It is astronomical. African Americans are 8 times more likely to serve time in jail than whites. And let me tell you, folks, that's not because they're committing more crimes. It's just not the case. The way to think about it, or a good statistic to think about, is that whites and blacks smoke marijuana. This is before it was legal in some places, in about equal proportions. Okay, actually, whites smoke a little bit more marijuana than do blacks. Yet there are far, far, far more blacks serving time for marijuana than there are whites, and they're serving longer sentences disproportionately than whites. And when you take and control that factor, it tells you that you are blind if you don't acknowledge that race is a major factor in who we sentence, whether we incarcerate them, and how long we put them in jail. And and there are so many ways. I mean, the justice system, the criminal justice system, has become the place where we just dump all of societal's problems and then we forget about it. So racism, we just ignore racism and we throw it to the criminal justice system, and then we incarcerate on people at outrageous rates, and nobody knows about it. And it's just going on right now where it's happening. What happened with the crack cocaine disparity, if people don't understand that, and let me just kind of put it simply, crack and cocaine are the same substance. They're just manufactured differently. And cocaine is a white person's drug. By far, it is a white person's drug. Crack is predominantly used by African Americans. It's an odd disparity, but it's a controlled truism. The sentencing guidelines required until recently that that the amount of crack was 100 times less than the amount of cocaine for the same sentence. So that if a person was found with an ounce of cocaine, they would get a sentence 100 times less than a person found with an ounce of crack. And what that means is that a white person was going to get a sentence 100 times less than a black person. And during the 90s and early 2000s, when we did this, huge amounts of African Americans were just poured into our prisons at great numbers because of this racial disparity. And that doesn't even account for implicit bias that goes on every day and actual bias that goes on every day and how we sentence people. You know, whites have a higher degree of drug use than do blacks. It's just I mean, we don't like to admit that as a society, but it's a truism. Yet blacks spend more and longer time in jail than whites do for similar crimes. So it is a huge problem that by and large we've ignored. We've accepted it. We have found easy ways to accept it. Well, that's because they commit more crime. Or even if you're maybe a little liberal, you say, well, that's because they're poor and therefore they commit more crime. Well, no, it's just not true. So a lot of the reasons, and it's not just the courts, can I say it's that entire street that I told you about. So communities of color get policed more than white communities do. It's just a truism. When you police more in communities, you get more arrests. When you get more arrests, you get more people into the criminal justice system. When you get them more in the criminal justice system. So it begins all along the way where every aspect of the criminal justice system, from that initial stop and who gets stopped, and I don't have to tell the African Americans on the call about who's likely to get stopped and who's not. But from that initial stop by police officers or the opportunity to be stopped, all the way through to sentencing and how long they get sentenced and who gets sentenced, race is the predominant and predictive role. And we can ignore it for as long as we want while we deal with other issues. But I hope not, because it is an absolute pock on our society. It's a pall that holds over this great American experiment that we're trying, and it's not talked about enough, and it's not working enough, and it's not, you know, can you tell what excites me? Sorry, folks, but let me just tell you something that by 25 years old, most people time out of committing crimes, right? It's just a statistic. 25 is about the level where mostly males, right, brains are beginning to be in certain ways that you time out. I always remember someone years ago saying, just keep your kids safe till then and you'll be fine. You know, just keep them safe till then. And I think that we need to totally and radically rethink the criminal justice system so that we treat people under 25 in the criminal justice system differently, because in large part, jail does them absolutely no good. And if we can find alternatives to jail and therefore lower the racial disparity of how we treat people, and if we keep them safe and out of jail and not hanging with career criminals, of all ages. I mean, we throw 22 and 23-year-olds into jail with 50 and 60-year-old, people suffering from mental health disease and whatever. It's not healthy. If we can only keep people safe and out of the system till 25, boy, the world would be a whole different place. We remove the problem of mass incarceration, racial injustice in our system would go down dramatically. So anyway, I'll stop there. I apologize for going over a little bit, but I really just want to shake the world and say, do you know that, in 40 years, it's going to be like, we ignored, not that it's the same thing, like, when the world ignored what was going on in Germany, when countries ignored what was going on in slavery for those decades, when people ignored the Jim Crow laws and what was happening. I think in 20 or 30 or 40 years, we're going to come back and we're going to say, folks, how could you have lifted knowing that the 2 million plus people, 3 million people that are incarcerated right now, predominantly people of color, that you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well, you have no reason to apologize for that and for your passion in this work. I think it is crucial to have folks like you working in our justice system bring awareness around this conversation. And again, the only way that we'll transcend this is if we confront it. If we confront our history, what's happening currently, and our role in it, and our role to change it. And I think this is such an appropriate conversation to have on the day that we're celebrating here, Beloved Community Day, because it isn't just about us hugging and loving one another as a community. It's about us doing the work, very hard work of confronting the ills of our society, and race is the central ill of our American society. So thank you for your work, Jack. It's essential and important, and for your work in spreading awareness around the importance of this conversation.
Thanks. So I do want to tell you, I spend far more time on bubbles than I do this issue, but I just want to keep it in perspective.
I think we got that. Jack, thank you so much for joining us today. We're at our time. We're sorry we could not answer all of our questions, but my bet is that we could ask you to come back again, Jack, and you might take us up on that invitation.
Maybe in person next time, yeah.
That would be wonderful. And just want to mention that we have a former teacher here, Alex, who's recalling bringing his class to your courtroom and the transformational experience that it was for the students and for him. So
yeah. Hey, Alex.
Thanks for joining us today. And Claire, and Jack, thank you again. And Claire, I'll hand it off to you to say goodbye.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for joining us and staying a couple minutes over. There were some resources, the new Jim Crow, the documentary 13th on Netflix have been fantastic to really dive into the school to prison pipeline if you want to know some more. And yes, I was thinking the same thing. Maybe you'd be willing to come back and share more of your passion with us, because it's absolutely warranted. And so, yeah, please check your emails and social media and blog posts for more conversations like this. We're honored to have you with us. And if anything comes to mind, please reach out to me directly, Claire Phipps here at Gordon School, and we're happy to work through those questions. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and a fantastic weekend.